All right. So for this unit, we're gonna spend a little time talking about romanticism, and I can say I think romanticism is going to be for our course is going to be one of the most significant philosophical periods that we're going to study. The Enlightenment is pretty important also for the book and the reading and the science that goes into ecology and the classification. But romanticism is really going to be a reaction against a lot of those formalistic um, very logical ways of looking at the world. The romantics, and this is not kissy kissy huggy huggy. This goes back to romantic romance and romance not being huggy huggy kissy kissy, but King Arthurian legends, and that's where the terminology is going to come from. We're not going to overly concern ourselves with that, but romanticism is going to reject a lot of the framework presented in the consequences that were created from the Enlightenment and from that overt scientific rationalism. And so we're going to start to see, as I hope over the course of this lecture and all the materials, the supporting materials that you've engaged with that romanticism is a reaction to we can say the Enlightenment, or I'm just going to say rationalism here. So let's go ahead and start kind of taking a look and picking this apart. So first off, let's just talk about the characteristics of romanticism. You should have already watched the school life video and you should have some idea, but it values feeling over reason. And so raw emotion is going to have a higher precedent within a romantic worldview than simple rationality. Next thing is going to place a lot of faith, and you can see faith is, kind of along that feeling in the imagination, the imaginative qualities of a person or in many cases of a child. The rationalist will say, oh, children need to be educated. And once they're properly educated, they can be meaningful contributors to our society and to our civilization. But until then, they're, kind of a uneducated problem. Romantics are going to say, no, 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 no. That childhood imagination, that innocence, that will be a priority. And that is very important to all of us. And so that's where we get that imagination and storytelling and myths and a lot of things the rationalists would say, unnecessary. So another thing that we see, I think, largely as a consequence of the unintended consequences of the Enlightenment, of rationality, is that civilization is going to have all sorts of pollution, child labor, factory work, urban, kind of reckless urbanization. And a lot of people are going to say, yeah, no, 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 no. I want to get back to nature. And that nature can take on the form of the pastoral that we've talked about. It can take on the form of raw, rugged wilderness, but it's going to be anything having to do with nature is going to supersede anything having to do with civilization. I hope over time you can see how in Montana, how we juggle these influences in our own society, because we're gonna spend a lot of time talking about this over the rest of the semester. The next thing is that innocence to sophistication, that kind of raw innocence. You don't have to be an urban, sophisticated person within the romantic. In fact, this sophistication is almost viewed as a limitation rather than as an asset, where innocence prioritized. We also get childhood innocence. Now, this one's interesting because anytime you have a philosophical shift from one period to the next period, the shift is pretty defined, not necessarily historically. Sometimes they can take a decade or more to morph into the next phase. But the new phase will, in this case, romanticism, will continue to build upon some of the strengths of the previous philosophical period, which was the Enlightenment. And we know during the Enlightenment that the individual's freedom and worth were highly prioritized, and they will continue to be in Romanticism. This will get morphed into what we refer to as a rugged individualism. kind of a Theodore Roosevelt type individualism, cowboy, rugged individualism, where if you have something to do, what do? Well, you just go damn well get it done. And uh, you'll see that coming up in the Elizabeth Gilbert piece that we're going to read in this unit's ancillary readings. But rugged individualism is going to be a big piece. All right. Past wisdom is trusted more than progress. Why? Because, well, as we know from up here, the civilization progress can be questionable. We all find ourselves, I think, saying that today in many cases. You know, we get these new technological gadgets. They're supposed to dramatically improve our lives. And after we have them for a while, you know, you can take our cell phones, for example, great handy little tools, but what are the consequences of using those? And so, might we not be better to sit around and read a book than jump into the latest social media craze on our phones? And so, trust past wisdom, not progress. Reflects on nature to gain spiritual wisdom. So, this gets back to that earlier notion. This is a very important piece for us in this course, nature as spiritual wisdom. So, the Romantics will view all of nature as God's most perfect creation. And so, by going into nature, you are going into somewhat, this might be a bit of a stretch, but I don't think to the romantic, you're literally walking within the imagination of God. And by doing that, you gain a spiritual cleansing, a spiritual elevation. You are gaining something more than just spending time in the outdoors. And so this is a really going to be a critical piece to us. I think the chapters that you are going to be reading for Unit 5, I'm hoping that you can see how these will start to influence our character. I'm spacing her name right now, but our character in the next reading assignment, Patricia, Patty Westerford. I think you'll start to see her character illustrating a lot of these. Finds beauty and truth in the supernatural or imaginative realms. So I don't know how many of you have read Rip Van Winkle. Many of you probably have not. It's not as common these days as it used to be. But Rip Van Winkle was written by Washington Irving, an early American romantic author. And he has this man who leaves the confines of his little town in the Hudson River Valley, which same as the Hudson River Valley painters, the Hudson River Valley, and he goes into the mountains, gets drunk with some elves or some supernatural mythical beings. He falls asleep for 20 years. And what does he do? He sleeps through the entire American Revolution. And he comes down out of the hills only to find that the flag has changed. It's no longer a British flag, it's now an American flag. And it was Washington Irving kind of poking fun at this idea of the Enlightenment and the benefits of rationalism. And yes, he wasn't mocking democracy, so to speak, or the American Revolution, but that we prized that rationality over mythology and supernatural stories and those sorts of things. So interesting. If you get a chance, go back and read Rip Van Winkle. It's great short story. Sees poetry as the highest work of the imagination. This won't be as important to us in this class, but poetry, especially for those of you who know your British poetry, the Romantic Lake District poets, Wordsworth, Coleridge, they love poetry, and they're poets, but at the same time, poetry by a whole generation of people will be highly sought after and respected and regarded. So the next one is myth, legend, and folklore. And this comes in that past wisdom will be highly regarded. And so we'll continue to see a lot of myth, legend, and folklore popping up all over the romantic experience, not just in Rip Van Winkle, but we'll see it all over the place. And I'll explain that in the next slides here. We'll continue to expand on that. All right, so one of the main components of the romantic worldview, romantic philosophy, romantic poetry, romantic landscape painting. The romantics are going to be fascinated with landscape painting. And landscape painting, for those of you who know art or are interested in art, is going to go through a major transformation as a result of romanticism. One thing I want to take a little side note here. I really want you all to work on a concrete understanding of how, as a society or a civilization, culture, we move through these philosophical periods. And there are pros and cons to all of these philosophical periods. None of them are perfect, and they all have great strengths and great limitations. But when we enter a new philosophical period, there's a lot that happens in that period. It's not just that books or stories from that period are similar. It's we see this philosophy, this kind of guiding philosophy applied across poetry, across art, across people's imaginations and how they view the world. All of these things are influenced by our contemporary philosophy or the contemporary philosophy of any group of people. So, one of the ultimate goals is that we'll all need to, or I hope, as we continue through this course, that you reflect upon what is our contemporary philosophy. And mostly, philosophies aren't defined until well after the fact. And so we're still in this period where we're trying to figure out who we are, which every generation and every group of people and every philosophical period is trying to figure out who they are and what matters to them. Well, it was the same case for the Romantics, but you see these common questions across the arts and across politics and across the view of democracy and governance. And all of these things are governed by these philosophies, or at least heavily influenced. So, art being similar here. So, the picturesque. The picturesque is sometimes associated with the beautiful, although both of these can have a component of beauty built into them. The sublime, although, as Burke would explain, can be terrifying, is still a beautiful terror. Now I'll get into that. But as we see these landscapes, we're going to see this is a famous chunk, although it's recreated. This is a famous chunk of Roman aqueduct, and that pulls in that ancient and that old mythological piece. We have vines growing on these other Roman ruins here. We have some new construction, human construction, but not nearly as large as the mountain. And then in most of these paintings, these landscape paintings, you're going to see something that we'll refer to as the light. And it's usually juxtaposed, as you can see here, with the dark. And that's going to be, we'll see that over here too. We've got kind of this line up here. We have the dark. Down here, we have the light. Very common. Even here, we have the green and the lush, which could be associated with life, with the light, with kind of this dark, mysterious forest. And so you'll continue to see, and I'm going to call this life. We can call it life, dark. We can call this death and life even. And so if we go back here for a second, well, I'm not going to go back quite yet. We'll get there in a moment. But you also will see if you do have humans in the painting, they will be in a prominent position, but they won't be the dominating force. They will be a piece of the landscape in terms of everything else that's going on. And so this is the picturesque versus the sublime. This would be the picturesque up here and these cliffs and this dark, and over here we'd have the sublime. And so the sublime, although there's two different definitions that you'll pick up on of the sublime. One is, this kind of wondrous, enlightened thing. The other that Burke would use and that the Romantics would start to use is the sublime is that awe-inspiring fear, power. It's something that limits human limits human control. And so I know many of you have probably walked into Glacier Park, and as you're walking through Glacier National Park or some other place with very steep terrain, you've walked up to the edge of the cliff. And as you walk up to the edge of the cliff, you look off that cliff and you go, oh, and you get those tingles down your spine, and your hair raises up maybe a little bit, and you get that little shot of adrenaline, and you take a step back and you walk backwards and you say, oh. And immediately, many of us, maybe not all of us, but many of us, what do we want to do? We want to walk back up. And we want that feeling of the sublime to enter back, the Burke's notion of the sublime to enter back into us. And why? What's attractive about that is that line, that edge, that cliff, we are seeing our own mortality. We walk right up to our mortality and we look off and we can see the limits of our own power, because one step forward and we cease to exist, or at least in this form, we cease to exist. So that's the sublime. The sublime can also be, obviously, we have cliffs here, lots of cliffs in romantic landscape painting, lots of storms. I don't know how many of you, have experienced a really powerful storm, being stuck outside on a fishing trip on a boat, or stuck in a tent, or maybe you had nothing in this, you were just out in a storm, or you ride the chairlift to the top of the ski mountain in the winter and the wind's gusting. And that's the sublime that Burke is interested in. And so here, obviously, we can see this gentleman in this famous romantic painting on the precipice or the edge. And right here is that line where over here we have mortality or we have death. We have the sublime, and we have the power, the sublimity of the mountain. And back here, which is interesting, it's still dark, but this way is to life and light. While at the same time, we have this one. This is a very complex painting from a romantic perspective, but we have all of these things being poked in. So I'll come back here and talk about dark romanticism in a moment. But if we get back to this first picture, you can see that same thing. We have two gentlemen. We have the broken, decaying naturalness, and we have the light. We have the sublime line of the cliff face. We've got other even higher cliffs here. And the humans who are in it are observing and partaking, but they're not a majority of the picture. They simply happen to be experiencing nature and experiencing God's divine creation as the romantics. And to be honest, the romantics weren't always terribly Christianized. Their notion of God was more in this notion of the divine. Some of them were very much Christian. Some of them were not as much. All right. But they were still very spiritual, regardless of, their specific religious intentionality. So here we move into the sublime is going to create a whole new form of literature, a whole new subgenre of literature. And that's going to be initially referred to as dark romanticism. But then as it starts to take off, we're going to see it renamed as Gothic literature. And so many of you have bumped into Gothic literature in your literary past and or just cultural experience. And that will be elements like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And so in Frankenstein, for those of you who have read it, we have this scientist, sometimes portrayed as kind of a mad scientist, but we have the scientist who uses science to create life. And in creating this life, creates this kind of innocent dark force, otherwise known as Frankenstein. And Frankenstein then runs around the rest of the book trying to figure out what it means to be human. And so great story, fantastic dark romantic Gothic literature. I highly encourage you to read it if you haven't. And then we also have Edgar Allan Poe. And Edgar Allan Poe, many of you have read those stories in middle school or high school. Edgar Allan Poe, American dark romantic or Gothic author, and had lots of under themes of death and mortality and guilt, and those things are all part of this kind of sublime, this experience of the sublime. And then finally, in the modern day, this evolution has led to, and this is actually one of the precursors of sci-fi, which you guys know I probably, or you, if you don't know, I love sci-fi. I teach a sci-fi class. Um, and so this is one of the early pieces of science fiction. It looks at the morality of human advancement as a result of the Enlightenment, often using a romantic lens. But then also we have horror. And why do people like horror? I personally am not a huge fan of horror fiction, but what's attractive about horror? It scares people. And that scare, that fear that people get when they watch horror often has, fiendish, devilish monsters, maybe mythological tales, maybe getting chased through dark forests. Like, I mean, this right here could be the setting for a horror story, I'm sure, or this could be the end of a horror story. This old castle could have some dark vampire horror elements in it. But you walk up to that precipice, and what happens usually in horror fiction? Usually the main character somehow survives. But what are they faced with? They're constantly on that brink of death, and they're constantly literally scared to death, but they don't die. And that makes them feel more alive. And the viewer, for those of you who like horror, it makes you feel more alive. And so that taste of the sublime, or dancing up to the edge of death in a fictional sense, and this is where horror comes from. That's our history with horror. Horror obviously also has a lot of roots in various mythologies and in various legends and old tales, which we know Romanticism greatly appreciates. So even though those supersede and have their own cultural history, this is where horror fiction comes from. So for those of you who like horror, maybe you picked up a little something there. All right. So the next one I want to talk about, this is kind of the next modern adaptation or version, but it's going to be well rooted in this 1800s period. Is it most of these stories are going to have what we refer to as the romantic journey, really important, and star that in your notes. And the romantic journey is a very simple structure. It is from the city to the country. And so for those of you who watch a lot of Western movies, we have the wagon train. The person comes from the East Coast, they get on a wagon, they move west. And as they're moving west, they go into the country. And what's that country? It's a movement from the city to the country. It's from the to corruption to God's country. And so then those terms are often used. So the romantic hero fits into that. And I'm not going to go into crazy detail on these. If we were teaching, if we were in a class that we were looking at romanticism in and of itself a little bit more in depth, we would delve in. And again, I hope that you see these overlaps in the Elizabeth Gilbert excerpt, the 2-page excerpt that I want you to read for this week. But American Westerns fit right into this romantic hero. And so the romantic hero is somebody who is more comfortable in the wilderness or in the pastoral, uncomfortable with the city, civilization, even town is a little questionable. What happens when the cowboy goes into town? They encounter, prostitution and drinking and vice and all of those things. And what happens when they're in the wilderness? They have this pure divine experience, and we see their purity. The romantic hero is usually young with this wilderness experience. The young, because we know the youthfulness, the imagination. They're not often very well conventionally educated, civilized from civilization, but they are very well educated within the ways of the natural world. And so we can see, this classic cowboy up here. Again, we have the picturesque and the sublime. This is not a romantic painting from the Romantic period. I think this is actually a fairly modern painting. But we see those same elements of romanticism coming into a contemporary landscape piece like this. For those of you who watch space opera or watch science fiction. Space opera is a subgenre of sci-fi, and this is from the show Serenity, and a fun space opera romp that I encourage you to check out. But space opera is really simply a Western in space. And so, for those of you who watch Star Wars, which we're going to watch a little Star Wars together in the next video that I make, but for those of you who watch Star Wars, Han Solo's character is a cowboy in space. In fact, he wears Civil War garb. A lot of these characters, a lot of Westerns, have Civil War veterans who head into the American West. And as in their adventure into the American West, they bring along their desire to leave themselves from the corruption of civilization, the corruption of the Civil War. And so Mal, this main character here, experiences that. So, anyways, westerns, space opera, horror, journey from the city to the country, all the elements of romanticism. I think at this point you should have most of that mostly under your belt. If you have any questions, let me know.